so David Hume died just in time to miss the American Revolution, which I'm sure he would have been very excited about. I'm not sure if he would have been on our side, but he was a historian. He wasn't just a philosopher. In fact, he was better known, better respected as a historian during his lifetime, when he publishes his first major work in philosophy in 1739. The guy's in his late 20s. He claims that the treatise of human nature, his first major work, he claims that it fell stillborn from the presses. What does that mean? Stillborn from the presses? Right. It just sort of came out there and fell flat, and nobody was there to sort of hear it. Right? It fell on deaf ears for Hume. He thought that some of the things he was saying in the treatise were very revolutionary, but nevertheless they were true. And what do I mean by revolutionary? Well, revolutionary in the sense that they challenged the status quo. They challenged the typical way that people were doing philosophy at the time. We talked about natural religion, not in any real detail, but we did mention it when we were talking about Leibniz and Spinoza, and they were practicing natural religion, and Hume was a staunch opponent to this way of doing philosophy. In fact, he thought it wasn't philosophy, that it was sophistry, it was just bad reasoning. You can't use science, you can't use philosophy or mathematics or anything like this to prove anything of a religious nature. Right? This has to do with the supernatural, not the natural. So Hume rejects natural religion, and that's perhaps one of the reasons that his work did fall stillborn from the presses, is he was just dismissed outright. How dare you challenge us? We're the guys who have all the university degrees, and we're the guys that have, these titles like head of philosophy of University of Gothenburg or whatever. So you can't be right, you ruffian. He was a Scottish guy, and he was kind of, I don't know what you'd call it. He was upper class, sure, but he was also a very naughty guy. I mean, he liked to go to France a lot, just kind of like Benjamin Franklin, We love him and all, but he wasn't exactly the most ethical person, at least by our standards, right? I think if Ben Franklin was running for president today, given his, personal life, right? I mean, just think about this, right? Anybody know about Benjamin Franklin? What did he do? What did he do when he was in Paris a lot of the time? He liked to party. Yeah, he liked to go visit the brothels too, right? And so did Hume. Hume was a bit like this too. I think out of all the philosophers that we'll be covering this semester, he's probably the only one maybe that you might want to have a beer with. The rest of them, I think, would be a little too stiff. Hume wouldn't be this way. Hume was kind of a fun guy. But I think maybe that might be part of the reason he wasn't taken so seriously as well, right, was his personality. He was taken pretty seriously as a historian. He worked on the history of the British Empire, and it was a very successful work. But now we consider him the most important, the most influential philosopher who ever wrote in English. It's pretty hard to dispute that, and that's, wow. If you have like a top 5, the most important philosophers in the history of Western thought, he would probably make the list, and he'd probably be the only one that made the list that wrote in English, right? Certainly you have to put Plato and Aristotle on that list, and they're Greeks, right? Certainly you'd also probably have to put Kant in that list, and he wrote in German. But Hume was an English-speaking guy, and really, if it wasn't for some guy like Kant, he probably wouldn't be as influential. We'll talk about this next time when we first get started on Kant. Kant was basically a rationalist to begin with in his early life. He loved Leibniz. He thought Leibniz was great. He was all about the rationalist philosophy. He was a strong advocate of Leibniz. But then when when Kant read Hume, this stirred him up. He said, this guy's kind of right, and that's a big deal. If Hume is right, then we can't continue doing philosophy the same way we've been doing it, because we've totally been mistaken. But because the treatise was so unsuccessful, Hume thought that maybe if he boiled it down to sort of its essence and maybe presented it in a more clear light for public or popular consumption, that maybe people would realize how significant his work was. And so he does this in the Inquiry. That's what we read. It's, we only read part of it, but it's a much less intimidating book to look at. I mean, look how thin it is. It's less, even this isn't even all the Inquiry, right? The Inquiry is only like 70 pages. There's even a couple essays after the Inquiry. The treatise is a very voluminous work. I mean, I think it's at least 500 or so pages. So he sort of says, all right, well, I'm just going to take the essence of the treatise. I'm going to write this Inquiry. So about 9 years later, he publishes the Inquiry concerning human understanding. So that's what we're going to look at here. There's a few things in the Inquiry that he sort of leaves out. Things about the self that are quite problematic, I think, for even his own philosophy. I'll try to get those in at least by the end of, not this lecture, but by the end of the lecture next time. But just for now, let's try to just get a general view of what Hume is doing here. What is his ultimate project, or what's his goal? And how does he go about challenging philosophy the way that I've been saying he does, right? What sort of challenges does he bring to the table? What sort of problems does he pose? Well, at the very beginning of your reading, he starts talking about philosophy in general terms, and he divides philosophy up into two species. Okay, so apparently there are two species of philosophy. So let's read here at the very beginning of the Inquiry, and let's just try to see if we can understand what the difference is between these two types of philosophy. I'm labeling one of them popular, and the other type is abstract philosophy. But he doesn't really give us a very clear definition or title of these types. He just really describes what they do, what they aim at, what is their methodology. So again, this is page 1, the very first page. And Hume writes, moral philosophy, or what you might call the science of human nature, may be treated after two different manners, each of which has its peculiar merit, and may contribute to the entertainment, instruction, and reformation of mankind. The one considers man chiefly as born for action, and as influenced in his measures by taste and sentiment, pursuing one object and avoiding another, according to the value with which these objects seem to possess, and according to the light in which they present themselves. As virtue of all objects is allowed to be the most valuable, this species of philosophers paint virtue in the most amiable colors, borrowing all helps from poetry and eloquence, and treating their subject in an easy and obvious manner, and such as is best fitted to please the imagination and engage the affections. They select the most striking examples and observations from common life. They place opposite characters in a proper contrast, and alluring us into the paths of virtue by the views of glory and happiness, they direct our steps in these paths by the soundest precepts and most illustrious examples. They make us feel the difference between vice and virtue. They excite and regulate our sentiments, and so they can but bend our hearts to the love of probity and true honor. They think that they have fully attained the end of all their labors. So there's a lot to unpack there about this first species of philosophers. First thing that he really says is that one of these species of philosophers, the first one, the popular one, it considers man as chiefly born for action. So it thinks of humans as active beings, right? I'll put up here, man as an active being. And they consider man as born for action, as influenced in his measures by taste and sentiment, pursuing one object, avoiding another. And what is the aim here? What are they aiming to do? These philosophers. They want to make us feel the difference between vice and virtue. defining it, but it sounds like he says here what they do is they borrow helps from poetry and elegance. They treat their subject in an easy and obvious manner. They select striking observations and instances from common life. They place opposite characters in proper contrast, and they allure us into the paths of virtue. They make us feel the difference between vice and virtue. So it's more of a kind of a visceral thing, right? It's like something to do with your pathos, right? You're just, I feel I feel empathetic to you, right? I feel empathy towards you, but because I read this story about good and bad, So it's almost like constructing an Aesop's fable. Anybody know Aesop's fables? Is that something that? So what were Aesop's fables? What were those?
Usually it's some sort of like animal story, and then it has a moral at the end of it.
Right. So what is the one of the fox and the grapes? You got the fox who wants to get these grapes that are hanging from the tree, and he keeps running after them, and he can't reach them, and eventually he says, they're probably sour anyway, right? That's where the term sour grapes comes from, I guess, right? The guy's like, I want to get with that girl, and then she rejects him. She wasn't that pretty anyway, right? Sour grapes, right? Sour grapes. So yeah, Aesop's fable would be an example. I guess he's not saying we should tell stories about animals, but just tell some stories that have a moral to them. So obviously this is not going to be like some rigorous abstract philosophy. This is a much more popular philosophy. It's more easy and obvious. We're just talking about situations, real life situations, and by explaining these situations, it's supposed to illustrate or help us feel the difference between right and wrong. And the aim, of course, as you said, is to make us a better person. Right? So that's this philosophy, the first species, right? It's more easy, more obvious. I guess because of that, it's more popular. It's more useful. I guess we can kind of see how it applies to our lives, Okay, I see what that story's trying to say. I knew a friend that was like that, or whatever. And it's also not as certain. It's not like mathematically certain, but usually it's taken to be that way. It's just common sense. You don't do that. Well, maybe it is common sense, but and maybe it's not. If it's common sense, maybe it's not based on certainty, but we still accept it as such, right? But what about this second species of philosophers? What does Hume say about the second species of philosophy? Second paragraph, he says, the other species of philosophers consider man in the light of a reasonable rather than an active being, and they endeavor to form his understanding more than cultivate his manners. They regard human nature as a subject of speculation, and with a narrow scrutiny they examine it in order to find those principles which regulate our understanding, excite our sentiments, and make us either approve or blame any particular object, action, or behavior. They think it is a reproach to all literature that philosophy should not yet have fixed beyond controversy the foundation of morals, of reasoning, and criticism, and should forever talk of truth and falsehood, vice and virtue, beauty and deformity, without being able to determine the source of these distinctions. While they attempt this arduous task, they are deterred by no difficulties, but proceeding from particular instances to general principles, they still push on their inquiries even further to principles even more general, and they rest not satisfied till they arrive at those original principles by which in every science all human curiosity must be bounded. And though their speculations seem abstract and even unintelligible to common readers, they aim at the approbation of the learned and the wise, and they think themselves sufficiently compensated for the labor of their entire lives if they can discover some hidden truths which may contribute to the instruction of posterity. Okay, so the abstract philosophy he's describing here sounds a lot more rigorous, but it's also obviously a lot more abstract. He even uses the term abstruse quite a bit. Abstruse, what does that mean? Right, unclear, right? the abstract philosophy see man as? Not the active being, but the rational being, right? Man as a rational being. And it tries to take that rationality and maybe take it out of that active context. I'm not thinking about man in a practical sense. What is man like when he's doing this? What is man like when he's doing that? No. What is man like insofar as he understands things? Very general. I want to know how man is. How does he understand any particular object? Not this object in this situation against this type of person, but just in general. Let's describe the nature of man's understanding in all of these things and what regulates our understanding. So obviously, this is going to be more difficult. It's more specialized, not a popular philosophy. Only people that are philosophers can really follow most of it. It's very specialized. So he also says that, and this is interesting, he says that the abstract philosopher, it vanishes whenever the author leaves the shade. What do you think he means by that? It vanishes when the author leaves the shade?
Basically, whenever they kind of explain their reasoning, it turns out to be untrue or something.
Well, not necessarily that it's untrue, but let's imagine we're Descartes and we're sitting in the shade. And we're sitting under our tree and we're writing the Meditations, right? And we're thinking to ourselves, well, heck, for all I know, there could be an evil genius fooling me into thinking that I'm here when I'm not. And we might even convince ourselves that this is a good argument. This is a rational argument. It makes sense. It could be true. Maybe I am being fooled by an evil genius. Well, what's going to happen when Descartes closes his book, gets up from under that tree, and leaves the shade? Is he going to doubt his own existence? Yeah, right. Maybe maybe when we were going over Descartes in class the other day, you were thinking, "Wow, this is right. Maybe my life is a dream. Maybe it is an illusion." But as soon as you packed your bags up, you got in your car. It's not like you were thinking, you're on the highway and you're like, "Well, maybe I could just drive off the highway and it's just an illusion. It's just a dream, right?" No, you're not going to do that. And so this abstract philosophy, although it might be based on principles that are certain or that are maybe intuitively acceptable, when you leave the shade and you get to practical life and you become active, you're not going to doubt your own existence. Somebody comes up to you and says, "I'm going to punch your lights out." You're going to dodge the punch, right? You're not going to doubt that the punch is going to hurt you. Maybe I'm not really here. So apparently, what was his name? Pyrrhus. He mentions Pyrrhus at the end, right? He was a skeptic that was supposed to be so skeptical that his followers had to walk around in case he got hurt, because he'd see a chariot coming straight for him and he wouldn't move out of the way, because for all he knows, maybe it's not really there. So his followers would have to push him out of the way in case he got. But we don't act like that. He's a nut. Pyrrhus was a nut. When we leave the shade, all of that abstract stuff might disappear. It doesn't really apply practically to our lives. So if the first species of philosopher, the more popular one, that seems to have more to do with morality and making you a better person, right? If that's the goal, if they're aiming at bending your heart to the love of probity and honor, making you feel the difference between right and wrong, what does Hume say what is the aim of this philosophy? What are they looking for?
We're trying to figure out what all human understanding is based on.
Right, the ultimate principles, the most basic principles of human understanding. What is it all based on? And I'll reread that last line from that passage. He says, excuse me, though their speculations seem abstract and even unintelligible to common readers, they aim at the approbation of the learned and the wise. So they're aiming at the approval of the people who are wise and learned. And they think themselves compensated for the labor of their entire lives if they can discover some hidden truths which may contribute to the instruction of posterity. So these are the ones who are going to work their whole lives on the same calculus problem that no one's ever solved before, right? I'm sure there's mathematicians that do this, right? They're dealing with some really high-order differential equations. I know there's a solution. There has to be a solution. impression that Hume is very critical of this second species of philosopher, and he is in a certain way. But I don't think he wants to completely disparage this type of inquiry. He says it's useful to think abstractly. It's useful to have theories. He says that we've gotten a lot of positive things out of this type of philosophy. He thinks that accuracy in our science is a good thing. Be more accurate. And it's even advantageous, he says, to beauty. I think he's thinking of art here. Since we have art theory, we have a theory of perspective and color theory and all this, it makes for better art. So he's not completely dissing the abstract philosophy. I think what he wants to show here in the inquiry are the limits of this type of philosophy. What can it do and what can't it do? And definitely when we're doing abstract philosophy, at least before Hume, we are involved in metaphysics at one point or another. We're going to inevitably do metaphysics. So if I'm an abstract philosopher in his sense of the word, inevitably this will, when I push myself as far as I can go, when I look for those basic ultimate principles of the universe, I'm going to be doing metaphysics. But what does Hume say about metaphysics? Does Hume like it? Is it good? No, not really.
Talk about it's not practical within the world.
Well, that's, for him, okay, so it's not practically applied to the real world. But what are its claims based on? When I make a metaphysical claim like Socrates that my soul cannot be harmed, what am I basing that on? Well,
So it's a belief.
I believe it, but Hume says I can't really prove it, sort of thing, right? I'm basing it on some assumption. Maybe I've convinced myself with abstract reasoning that it must be so. But for him, it's not really based on any experience that I've had, right? I've never looked at a soul and seen it. I've never looked at a soul and saw people trying to destroy it. Oh, look, they shot a soul, but it wasn't harmed. Look, they beat up a soul and it wasn't harmed. So I know a soul cannot be harmed if it's a good soul. No, so for Hume, remember, he's an empiricist. If this is not based on some experience, then what is it based on? And here's where he gets, I don't know, he should have known that he was going to really piss some people off with this stuff. But on page 5, at the bottom, his biting claim that metaphysics is not properly a science, that we need to abandon metaphysics altogether. I think that's been a popular theme probably ever since Hume. But when he came out, right, he wasn't so popular. It took Kant to kind of bring this about. Well, maybe we need to stop doing metaphysics because it's trying to investigate things that perhaps human understanding cannot really get to, right? It's beyond the limits of our understanding. So here's what he says about metaphysics at the bottom of page 5. Here indeed lies the justice and most plausible objection against a considerable part of metaphysics, that they are not properly a science, but arise either from the fruitless efforts of human vanity, which would penetrate into subjects utterly inaccessible to the understanding, or from the craft of popular superstitions, which, being unable to defend themselves on fair ground, raise these entangling brambles to cover and protect their weakness. Chased from the open country, these robbers fly into the forest and lie in wait to break in upon every unguarded avenue of the mind and overwhelm it with religious fears and prejudices. So what is he basically saying there? Metaphysics arises from what? Either human vanity or from religious fears and prejudices? What does he mean by human vanity? Why do we come up with metaphysics out of our vanity? What does it mean to be vain? Nobody?
Like the best.
Okay, right. Yeah, you have this sort of I'm so pretty, I'm so pretty. That's areas of vanity. You're concerned so much with your looks and all this, but I think he's thinking of, we think we're so good, we think we're so special, we think we're so smart that we can understand metaphysics, that we can understand the underlying laws of the entire universe. Come on, we're not that great. We're pretty cool, but we're not able to do that. So that's the vanity. defend themselves on fair ground, so they have to make up some stuff. Metaphysics. Right? Kind of what he's saying. So someone like Leibniz didn't read this, but if he would have read this, he would have been pretty angry. Right? He probably, what does he say about him? These robbers, he's a robber. They fly into the forest, they lie in wait to break in upon every unguarded avenue of the mind and overwhelm it with religious fears and prejudices, right? A natural religionist would not be happy reading this passage, right? So what is he telling us to do? He's saying, what we need to do is we need to stop marrying our religion with our science, our superstition with our science. He says, if we stop doing this, we can make some real progress in the sciences. What he's basically calling for here is known as scientific naturalism, which is kind of a no-brainer for most scientists today. I think almost all scientists are naturalists, but they weren't. Remember, natural religion was really popular when he's writing this. What does it mean, scientific naturalism? He doesn't use this term, but that's basically what he's advocating here. He says when we do science, all of our explanations need to be natural explanations as opposed to supernatural explanations, right? If I'm a scientist, I'm looking for scientific, naturalistic explanations. So if somebody asks me why the planets move the way they move, I can't just say, because God made them do that. That's not a scientific explanation, right? Well, is it? No, it's not a scientific explanation. So Hume says all science should, but you know what? Leibniz might have said it was. It is a scientific explanation, but we have to explain God more in more detail to give you a better understanding of it. Hume says no, right? No. We have to have something observable, and we have to be able to test it, right? And we have to use natural causes to explain nature. We can't use supernatural causes to explain the natural world. But before we even get started on any type of science, Hume says we have to do one particular science first, and that is a science of human understanding. This is a prerequisite. Before we conduct any scientific experiments, before we start developing any real science, we have to get straight about human understanding. Why do you think that's so important to do first, before I do science in general? Why do I have to know about human understanding and the nature of it?
So we know where all of our ideas come from.
Right. How do I get to have knowledge? We got to do a little epistemology. Where do my ideas and my knowledge, where does it originate? And also, do I somehow alter those inputs? Let's imagine that you're a scientist and you're making observations through this telescope that's off by a couple notches. But you don't know that it's off by a couple of notches. And so you just keep looking through this telescope, making your observations and your measurements, but they're all off by like 2 or 3 degrees or whatever. Now you have bad information, it's off by 2 or 3 degrees, and you have to base your hypotheses and your theories on those bad measurements. How likely is it that you're going to come up with a nice airtight good theory with that bad telescope? Not likely, right? Unless maybe you yourself are off by 2 or 3 notches in the other direction and it kind of evens out or something like that. So if we think of ourselves as the telescope, right? We are the instrument, ultimately. We are the observer. We are the ones doing the science. If we ourselves are off by 2 or 3 notches, we need to know that so we can adjust our measurements. And so that's what Hume, I think, has got going on in his head up here when he says a science of human understanding is necessary before we do any other type of science at all. So how does he begin? He starts by differentiating between perceptions of the mind, he calls them, and perceptions of memory and imagination. Perceptions of the mind, or what we would call impressions from here on out. Impressions. This is one type of thing that this is one of the this is part of the content of experience. Part of my experience is made up of impressions, direct impressions that I have. Perceptions, a thought that I'm thinking, something that I see out there in the world, right? This would be something that he he says, is copied from a direct impression. A thought or idea is something that is copied from a direct impression. So it doesn't have as much force or as much vivacity. So sensations, emotions that I feel, right, this would all be under impressions. Sensations, emotions that are felt directly. Of course, I can understand emotions, so that would be it. But if I understand an emotion, that would be a thought or an idea. Emotions understood or maybe remembered. Right? You know, when I get dumped, I feel sad. Right? So I feel that emotion of sadness. Right? But then I get over it, and 5 years later, I remember. Oh, I remember when I got dumped and I felt sad. Well, I'm not feeling sad at that moment, but I remember what it was like. So that's a thought or an idea, but it's always going to be based on that direct experience that I had of sadness. Right? Or, you know, if I'm just, if I've ever been scared or terrified in my life, I know what that feels like, right? I'll directly feel terror. But then maybe I go watch a movie where somebody else is feeling terror, but I'm not. I understand what they're feeling, but I'm not feeling it directly myself. Hume says that all of these thoughts and ideas, any one that we could possibly have, is always based on a previous impression. So the only reason I'm able to look at the person who's terrified and understand what that feels like is because I've been terrified as well. I felt that emotion directly. The only reason I could ever have an idea of what he says, a gold mountain, that's the example that he uses of an idea or thought. It's not because I've actually seen a gold mountain, but I've seen other things like it. I've seen mountains, or maybe a picture of a mountain. I've seen gold, or pictures of gold, or whatever. And I simply just take those experiences that I directly have, these direct sensations, and I just put them together up here in my head. Right? And it seems like I have this unbounded liberty of thought. I can think about just about everything, right? Well, not exactly. Once I reflect on it, Hume says, I can only think about something I previously experienced. Right? So there is a limit to what thought can do. It's not completely unbounded. Let's read here on page, what is it? Page 11, I think. Second paragraph. Our thought seems to possess this unbounded liberty, but we shall find upon a nearer examination that it is really confined within very narrow limits, and that all of this creative power of the mind amounts to no more than the faculty of compounding, transposing, augmenting, or diminishing the materials afforded us by the senses and by experience. When we think of a golden mountain, we only join two consistent ideas, gold and mountain, with which we were formerly acquainted. A virtuous horse we can conceive, because from our own feeling we can conceive virtue. This we may unite to the figure and shape of a horse, which is an animal familiar to us. In short, all the materials of thinking are derived either from our outward or our inward sentiment. The mixture and composition of these belongs alone to the mind and will. Or to express myself in philosophical language, all of our ideas, or more feeble perceptions, are copies of our impressions, or just more lively ones. So, how does he prove this? Well, he like I said last time, I think I gave you this in a class, it's more of an appeal. He asks you, well, you prove me wrong. Can you think of any thought or idea that you have that wasn't based on a previous impression? Well, can you? No? What about God? That's a thought or an idea that you have. But what previous impression was that based on? Well, Hume's got an answer for you. Page 11 there, skipping a little bit from where I left off. Even the idea of God as meaning an infinitely intelligent, wise, and good we shall always find that every idea which we examine is copied from a similar impression. Those who would assert that this position is not universally true, nor without exception, have only one, and that's a very easy method of refuting it, by producing that idea which in their opinion is not derived from this source. It will then be incumbent upon us, if we would maintain our doctrine, to produce the impression or lively perception which corresponds to it. So God, I just get a notion of God, if I'm thinking of God as this infinitely good and intelligent being, well, I just think about my own intelligence, and I just say, well, it's way more intelligent than that. This being that's beyond my own, as smart as you could possibly be, right? So I have an idea of my intelligence, I have an idea of my goodness, and I just multiply that times infinity, and there's where I get this idea of God. And he really thinks that this is true of all of my thoughts and my ideas, that we'll find that when we really think about it, they can all be reduced to at least one previous impression that I've had before. If you're still not convinced, he's got a second appeal to you, right? He asks you the question here right where I left off. Secondly, right, if it happens from a defect of the organ that a man is not susceptible of any species of sensation, we always find that he is as little susceptible of the correspondent ideas. So, for instance, a blind man can form no notion of colors, a deaf man of sounds. Restore either of them that sense in which he is deficient, and by opening this new inlet for his sensations, you also open an inlet for the ideas, and he finds no difficulty in conceiving these objects. The case is the same if the object proper for exciting a sensation has never been applied to the organ. So, and what's he basically saying there? So if I'm blind, then am I going to have any idea of color? If I've been blind from birth? So if I've never seen any color ever in my whole entire life, would I know red, what red is? I mean, I might hear the word, and I know what people are trying to say, but I really don't directly know what color is. I don't know, there's this silly movie from the 80s called Mask, and anybody ever seen it? It's got Cher in it, it's really old, and it's kind of funny to watch because it came out when I was a kid. It's nostalgic, I guess, but Mask is about a guy who's got, I forgot what the disease is, elephantitis or something like that. He's a very ugly person, right? He's got a really big face, it's distorted, and his girlfriend's blind, right? He falls in love with this blind girl, and he tries to describe to her color, and she doesn't know what it is. She's like, oh, people have tried to explain the color to me forever, I don't get it. You remember what he does to make her understand color? He gets a bunch of cotton balls, and he makes her feel them, and that's white. And then he gets a rock really, really hot in the boiling water. That's red. Stuff like this, She's like, oh, I get it, I understand. It's like, the cheesy music in the background or whatever. But I don't buy it. She wouldn't buy it either, right? She doesn't know what red is, right? There is this theory in art, in aesthetics, right? The philosophy of art, that people are capable of things like this. And that also that certain qualities might be associated with others, right? Like I might look at a number, and I always see the number 1 as red, right? Something like this. Or 6 is always green, or something like that. I can't remember this. Synesthesia, synesthetics, I think is the term for this, right? And you hear, if you listen to, read critics of music, especially, or even people describing classical music, it's a bright sound, right? Higher chords, major chords, they have an open sound to them. Minor chords are more dark or tragic or something like this. You're using weird words to describe sounds, right? But if you're if you believe in synesthesia, then you're going to say, oh, okay, well, that's cool, that they overlap. But Hume's going to say, no. If you've never seen anything, you're not going to know what color is. If you've never heard anything, you're not going to know what a trumpet sounds like. It's just not going to work. And the same is true, he says, if the object proper for exciting the sensation has never been applied to the organ. So, like we were talking about the avocado last time, if the object proper for exciting the sensation, the avocado, which is proper for exciting the sensation of tasting the avocado, if that's never been applied to your tongue, produce a thought or an idea without having a previous impression of it. And so he does mention one possible counterexample to his doctrine, but he says it's so rare that it's not that important. Does anybody remember this from the reading? What is the one exception that he mentions? I really don't think it's an exception if you think about it. I think he's being too hard on himself. He mentions this, everybody's wearing blue today, so that's kind of weird. Not everybody, but a lot of you are wearing blue. So the shade of blue, you remember that from the reading? No? Missing shade of blue, what does he say about it? So if I've seen like 20 or 30 different shades of blue, but there's one shade I've never seen, what does he say?
Doesn't he say that you can come to the conclusion between the two of them what the missing one is?
Right. So, imagine I've seen like 20 shades of blue, and there's this 21st shade that I've never seen. And he says, well, okay, imagine all the shades that I've seen were just sort of put on a spectrum from darkest to lightest, and there was like this one missing black spot with that one missing shade not there. He says, in that case, okay, maybe I could fill in the gap, right? So that would be one thought or idea that I came up with without having a previous impression of it. But he says that exception is so rare, it's not that big deal. But to me, I don't think it's that much of an exception. I think he's being a little too hard on himself, or he's not thinking this through properly. I think when he fills in that missing shade of blue, maybe he is basing it on previous experience. Maybe, right? And what's he kind of doing? He's saying, okay, well, whatever that missing shade is, it's a little darker than the one on the right, and it's a little bit lighter than the one on the left, okay? So he can use his experience of those two shades of blue that are, on either side of it, plus he's probably had an experience of things getting darker and things getting lighter, right? When the sun goes down, things get darker. When the sun comes up, they get lighter, right? You go to the house with those fancy lights that sort of, like I have in my dining room where you can sort of adjust it and stuff like that. So those are previous experiences that you could be basing that missing shade on. So I don't even think this is that much of an exception, if it is at all. But that's the only one he mentioned. He says, yeah, when it comes down to it, all of our thoughts, all of our ideas, always based on one of these. Something I've had an impression of, that I've felt, or that I've seen with my senses. So, he says, what's the payoff here with his doctrine? How does this affect philosophy in general? Well, next class we'll really get to his attack of philosophy. We're still kind of setting down his basic doctrine. But at this point, he says, look, if there's some philosophical term that we're unsure about, something that's confusing us, some concept that Leibniz wants to throw at us, and we're like, well, what is that? I don't know, I'm not really sure I get it. If there's any idea or thought or concept like that that's a philosophical concept, we should ask ourselves, what previous impression was that based on? If we can't find any previous impression that the idea was based on, Hume says, let's throw that idea out. It doesn't mean anything. It's nonsense. So let's think about it. So far this semester, are there anything that we've learned about that would fall into that category? A philosophical concept or idea that's not based on a previous impression? The forms, right? That's probably the most obvious example, Plato's forms. Have you ever had an impression of a form? Or a sensation of a form? Have you ever had an impression of the form of a chair? No. So throw those out. Forms are gone. Remember we were talking about monads, I think, last time? Leibniz's monads, the little particles that everything's made up of, right? You ever seen one of those? No impression of it. It's wrong, gone. So, so a lot of philosophers, if they're reading this, they're getting really angry. Monads! Don't take away my precious monads! That's Leibniz, right? So again, if there's any philosophical term we're suspicious about, we should ask of it. What impression was it based on? If we can't find an answer, then we should doubt we should reject it, right? We should doubt its cogency, its validity. Okay, moving on to the next section here. He's laid out, he's sort of laid out the basics. He's laid out his basic epistemology. Where do our ideas and our thoughts come from? Well, they're from our sensations, or things that we felt before. Impressions, as he calls them. But moving on, he says, look, obviously our experience has some order to it. It's not like each moment is completely detached from the moment before it. There's a certain continuity to our experience, right? It's got some sort of order. So how do we do this? How do we order our experience? He says there are three So 3 principles of connection, right, among our thoughts and ideas. Now, what are these? One of them he calls resemblance. The other one is contiguity. And then, more importantly, the one he really focuses on a lot, I think, cause and effect. So, resemblance, right? I see something out there and it reminds me of something else. That's one way that I connect ideas. I see a picture of my friend, it reminds me of my actual friend. Contiguity, the example he uses, it's a bit outdated, but it's almost like I see one thing and I assume others based on what I see. So best example I can think of is if you go visit your friend at his or her apartment, right? Especially if they live in like one of these really big apartment complexes that's like cookie cutter. I remember I used to live in one in Austin where there was only 3 floor plans for the whole apartment complex. So if you knew enough neighbors, you'd seen every apartment in the whole place, right? Not literally, but you pretty much knew what they all looked like on the inside. So you go visit your friend in this cookie cutter cubicle apartment, and you don't see all the other apartments, but because of contiguity, you know they're there, right? But there's this contiguousness about that complex. Okay, there's 8 rooms in this building, and so they probably are attached this way. You're not seeing them, you're not perceiving them directly, but nonetheless, because of contiguity, you assume they exist. Now, there's also this connection of cause and effect, which Hume really makes a big deal about. Cause and effect, cut leads to pain, right? I'm cut and there's pain. And even if I'm not cut, I know that, right? There's a connection between those 2 ideas, right? Being cut and feeling pain. So these are the 3 principles of connection. Hume says perhaps this is not an exhaustive list. Maybe there are other principles of connection. And he says it'd be really difficult to know we had all of them. All we can do is look at our experience and see if our connections boil down to these 3. And he thinks more or less they do. But it's not important even if there are more, because he seems to think that cause and effect is really what most of the important judgments we make are based on, at least the judgments that he's going to look at when we turn to the next section. Right? So this is a very short section, 3 principles of connection. I don't want to dwell on it too much, but resemblance, contiguity, cause and effect, and really we'll see what the problem here is when we do this. Because remember, he's like, I'm going to do this science of human understanding. I want to know how it is that we come to have knowledge of the objects around us. And they also want to know, what evidence do we base our claims on, right? And if that isn't very solid evidence, then maybe we should sort of be humble about the claims that we make. Maybe we shouldn't be so vain, I guess to use his word, right? We need to let go of that human vanity. Okay, well now we get to, this is even more important, this next section, I think, when he distinguishes between what he calls relations of ideas. This is one of the objects of human understanding, or one of the type of the objects of human understanding, relations of ideas. The other type, matters of fact. So, what is he saying here? We've got 3 principles of connection that he's just discussed. So these are what we use to connect our impressions. This is what we use to connect our different experiences, okay? These are the different categories of the things that we understand, right? What he calls objects of human understanding. Things that humans are capable of understanding. Objects of human understanding. Some objects of human understanding are what he calls relations of ideas. Some objects of human understanding are called matters of fact. Matters of matter. Catch me on that. Matters of fact. What is the difference? Relations of ideas, he says, are things like, things we know about math, things we know about geometry, arithmetic, that's pretty much it. He says these are the kind of things that you can discover the truth of just by thinking about them. Just by thinking about what two means and understanding what two means. Understanding what plus means. Understanding what equal means. There's a relationship between those ideas that you can arrive at as long as you understand what those terms are. So you know 2 plus 2 equals 4. You don't have to consult the world around you to prove that they're true. If I'm trying to prove that 2 plus 2 equals 4, I don't have to, somebody asks you, well, how do you know 2 plus 2 equals 4? Prove it. I don't go like this. Oh, well, the other day I was in my backyard and I saw 2 birds on the fence. And then a few minutes later, 2 other birds flew up next to them. And there were 4 birds. So 2 plus 2 equals 4. I mean, that might be how they tell you on Sesame Street, right, to help you learn how to add. But that's not why 2 plus 2 equals 4, right? 2 plus 2 equals 4 just because of what those terms mean. It has to do with the relation of the ideas, not with any birds out there in the world. Even if there were no birds, if they all went extinct tomorrow, 2 plus 2 would still be 4, right? So he says that these types of objects of human understanding, he says these have the quality of being a priori, or a priori, depending how you want to say it, the Latin phrase. A priori, true regardless of context, true regardless of outcomes or anything to do with the physical world out there. The matters of fact, he says, are a posteriori. So what would be an example of a matter of fact? Relations of ideas, pretty much just math. Math, geometry, arithmetic, maybe logic, basic logic, things like that. These things you know are true regardless of any other thing, any other context. They're true merely just given the nature of the terms and the way the terms relate to each other. But the same is not true for matters of fact. These are a posteriori. That is, I can't know the truth of them until after I consult experience or I look at the context. So what would be an example of a matter of fact? Probably the most controversial example he gives, the sun will rise tomorrow. That's a matter of fact. And when will I know for sure, absolutely, that the sun will actually rise tomorrow? Once it's risen, right? After it rises, okay? And so the sun will rise tomorrow is not an a priori truth, okay? And Hume thinks that a lot of philosophers have taken it to be such, that scientific truths, things like this, a priori. Hume says no, there's only a very small amount of our knowledge that's a priori. It all has to do with math, arithmetic, geometry. Most of what we're dealing with are matters of fact. The fact that the sun will rise tomorrow. Now, Hume will agree. I think it will rise tomorrow. I'll bet on it, sure. But it's just not a priori. It's not absolutely necessary. It's not certain. And we'll never know until it happens. So a good way to sort of remember the difference, right, and not get confused between a priori, a posteriori, is we'll just look. Prior, we all know what that means, right? Before, right? Post, after, right? So these are things that I can know prior to consulting any sort of experience. I can know 2 plus 2 equals 4 prior to seeing 2 birds turn into 4 birds, or you know what I mean, the example I was just giving, right? This does not, I don't rely on experience to know the truth of this. As Hume says, I can arrive and understand the truth of this by the mere operation of thought. Whereas if I want to know the truth of a posteriori claims, I have to wait until after it's happened. Then I can say with certainty that it did happen. I can't know the sun's going to rise tomorrow until it does. Yeah.
Isn't that experience anyway, though, that you know 2 plus 2 equals 4? You have experience in that?
You have experience of learning it, sure. But that truth, 2 plus 2 equals 4, did not rely on the fact that you learned it, right? So maybe you learned it from experience, right? You went to school and they taught you about numbers and you learned how to add and things like this. What Hume is saying is, even if nobody ever went to school, and even if nobody on the earth ever learned about 2 + 2 = 4, it would still be a fact, right? It would still be true. And so it's the fact that 2 + 2 = 4, that fact doesn't rely on you learning it. You see what I'm saying? So sure, you're right. You know, when I'm born, I don't know that 2 + 2 = 4. I have to learn math. I have to learn arithmetic, right? But what makes it true has nothing to do with observation, right? And when it comes to the world around me that I'm observing, that the same doesn't hold, right? I mean, why do I think the sun will rise tomorrow? It always happens, right? It's always happened. So I'm basing that strictly on experience, right? Strictly. Whereas 2 + 2 = 4, sure, I learned it in my life at some point, but I'm not saying, well, it's true because I learned it, right? Or it's true because that's what I was taught, right? No, it's true because it's true, right? Because that's 2 + 2 = 4. Unless you've got some other funky math that I've never heard of, where 2 + 2 is not 4. Right? But, you know, he kind of leaves these alone a bit, right? Because he thinks, look, these are certain, they don't say much, he says, about the world around us. Maybe he's wrong about that, right? That, yeah, 2 + 2 = 4, but what does that have to do with anything here in this world, right? Maybe he's a little bit behind the times with science there. But on the other hand, though, the truth of mathematical statements does not rely on my observations, right? Any other thing does. Any matter of fact does. If I want to know the truth of a statement like the sun will rise tomorrow, or tomorrow the high will be 78 degrees, you know, or the low will be 32 or something like that, right? It will not snow in Texas tomorrow. I'm pretty sure it's not going to snow in Texas tomorrow. But am I certain? Absolutely certain? Is that an a priori truth? No, it isn't, right? I mean, I don't think it will, but who knows, right? Maybe it will. Yeah, way up north, they might get like flurries of snow or something like this, right? I'm pretty sure the sun will rise tomorrow, but maybe it won't. Maybe like some catastrophe will happen. I don't know, like the scientists were off by like, they forgot to carry the one or something. You know, it's going to explode tomorrow. They thought it was going to explode in a billion years, but it's actually, they forgot to, they messed the decimal up or something like that, like I always do. It's a negative number, it wasn't positive or something. Right. So he's going to leave this stuff alone. Like mathematics, algebra, geometry, these are nice and certain, and okay, we're cool. We're on very stable ground with this stuff. Once we understand it, we understand that it's always going to be true, just given the nature of the definitions, the way we define the terms, the way we set things up, they're true. But these are different, and we want to know what the nature of the evidence is for this stuff. Why do we believe matters of fact? Particularly, why do we believe matters of fact that are not currently present? You know, it's a matter of fact that you're sitting here. You know, Marcus is sitting on the front row. Okay, well, how do I know that? Because I see him, right? But if I say something like, my friend is visiting Paris right now, I don't see him. I don't, like, look over the sea and, oh, look, there he is. Kind of hard to see him.
On Facebook.
Yeah, no, that's what you would say. And what I'm doing there is I'm using this connection of cause and effect, right? I'm saying, well, he posted a picture on Facebook. He wouldn't be able to do that unless he was actually there, right? So he must be there. But is it absolutely certain that he's in Paris just because he posted on Facebook that he's there? Well, what could happen? What did he do, maybe? He did Photoshop, right? Or maybe he went to Las Vegas and went in front of the fake Eiffel Tower or something like that. I couldn't tell, right? I'm not that discerning, right? So he thinks most of our judgments, whenever they're judgments on matters of fact, whenever they go beyond our direct experience, whenever I say my friend is in France or whatever, we're always using this connection of cause and effect. So we've got to look at that connection and see, well, what exactly is the nature of this connection? Is it an a priori connection, or is it an a posteriori connection? What do you think he's going to say? A priori or a posteriori? Posteriori, right? It's not necessary, even the sun has risen every single day doesn't mean it will rise tomorrow. It's an a posteriori connection. We will never be certain until it does, until it happens. Okay. Let me read here on page 16. This is where we get his explanation for basically what I've just been saying, right? He says, all reasonings concerning matters of fact seem to be founded on the relation of cause and effect. By means of that relation alone, we can go beyond the evidence of our memory and our senses. If you were to ask a man why he believes any matter of fact which is absent, for instance, that his friend is in the country or in France, he would give you a reason, and this reason would be some other fact, as a letter received from him, or the knowledge of his former resolutions and promises. A man finding a watch or any other machine in a desert island would conclude that there had once been men in that island. All of our reasonings concerning fact are of the same nature. So, basically he's boiling it all down to this one connection of cause and effect. This is what we use to go beyond our present direct experience and make assertions about things that we don't see directly, right? About our friend visiting France or whatever. But we always suppose a connection, and it's always a supposition. We suppose a connection in these instances between the present fact and what we assert. And this connection is not a priori, right? It's a posteriori. It arises entirely from our experience. And we often deceive ourselves into thinking that the connection of cause and effect is a form of a priori reasoning. We become accustomed to familiar motions, like let's say we play pool a lot, and we get really good at the game of pool, or billiards as he calls it, and we know the physics of the game. We start to think of cause and effect as, well, it's always going to be this way. If I hit the ball with this much force at this angle, it's going to have this sort of reaction. We believe this. We trick our mind into thinking it, but for him, this is just an illusion. It's an illusion of necessity, which is created by this familiarity. Page 18, he says, we are apt to imagine that we could discover these effects by the mere operation of our reason, without any experience. We fancy that were we brought on a sudden into this world, we could at first have inferred that one billiard ball would communicate motion to another upon impulse, and that we needed not to have waited for the event in order to pronounce with certainty concerning it. Such is the influence of custom, that where it is strongest, it not only covers our natural ignorance, but even conceals it, and seems not to take place, merely because it is found in the highest degree. But to convince us that all the laws of nature and all the operations of bodies, without exception, are known only by experience, the following reflections may perhaps suffice. Were any object presented to us, and were we required to pronounce concerning the effect which will result from it, without consulting any past observation, after which manner, I beseech you, must the mind proceed in this operation? It must invent or imagine some event which it ascribes to the object as its effect, and it is plain that this invention must be entirely arbitrary. The mind can never possibly find the effect in the supposed cause by the most accurate scrutiny and examination, for the effect is totally different from the cause, and consequently can never be discovered in it. So, what's he saying here? The cause is always separate from the effect. They're distinct. And any connection that I make between them is something that I do. And it's not a necessary connection that I make. So, if I walk over here to the light switch, let's say, right, and I'll flip off the lights. What happens? All the lights turn off. Okay. So I want to ask you, well, what made the lights turn off? Why did they turn off? Well, because you flipped the switch. Turn it back on. And maybe if you know a little bit more about electricity, or maybe you've run cables before or something, you have maybe a more sophisticated idea of cause and effect that's going on in your head right now. You're thinking of the wires going up and all this, resistors and things like that. But what if I told you that, no, you're wrong. I'm going to dispute that cause. lights went off when I flipped the switch was not because the current stopped running to the lights. That light switch is it's fake, actually. I had it set up to look like a light switch, but really, I've got this really complicated thing going on where I have an assistant who is watching us right now. There's a hidden camera here in the classroom. And whenever I walk over to the light switch, right? No, that's not it. That looks like it. Good guess, right? When I walk over the light switch, my assistant can see me with the camera, right? And whenever I flip the light off or on, I give him a signal or something, he actually turns the light switch off. He's got a switchboard in front of him that controls all the electricity on the campus, right? So I've explained what caused the lights going off, and you probably don't believe me. Yeah, that's ridiculous. That's far-fetched. Yeah, right. I actually believe that it's just the light switch that's turning the lights off, not your assistant across campus. Okay, you don't believe me? Prove me wrong. Can you prove me wrong? How? Okay, so you're gonna say you're ridiculous. It's hard to get through these walls, right? But let's say you rip through the walls, you show me all the wires and everything, and look, the wires are leading up to the light switch, to the light bulbs, so the switch is connected, and I'm like, oh, I really went all out for this, right? I mean, I put the wires in the wall so it looks like they're the ones that are doing it, but it's just fake, right? So you get really angry, you're like, oh, this is ridiculous, I don't like you, and then you grab the cables, right? See the electricity going through them, and you die as you're trying to prove me wrong. And then I say, haha, good try, valiant effort. But yeah, there is current going through it, but once it gets to the light bulbs, there's a resistor, right, that stops the current. And the actual source of electricity is above the light bulbs, right? Anyway, we could go on and on about this, and you can keep trying to prove me wrong. But I can keep making up all these stories, right, about what the true cause, what the real cause is. And for Hume, we can never know for certain. Maybe some causes are more plausible than others. Some are based on experience. If I told you a little green elf is up there, turning the switches on and off, you'd be like, what? I've never seen a green elf. You're full of it, right? So some explanations are based on experience. Some we can just make up fanciful. But for all we know, none of them can be right. And so this connection of cause and effect, a posteriori, not a priori. When we come back next week, we'll get into some of the other difficulties with cause and effect, and we'll apply these to other philosophers. What does this mean for philosophy in general? So have a good weekend. I'll have your papers graded hopefully by next time. Make sure you sign in if you got here late. I'll see you guys on Tuesday. Auf Wiedersehen. Yeah, hopefully the sun will rise.